Welcome back, y'all, to the discussion for this week's Torah portion, the first portion of Deuteronomy called Devarim, which is also the Hebrew name for the book of Deuteronomy. Our portion is Deuteronomy 1 through 3:22. Yes, it's one that leaves us dangling in the middle of a chapter. So, Leonard, we start in winter at the shores of, well, we are near the Jordan, right? Yeah. We're on the other side of the Jordan.
Yes. They haven't crossed the Jordan yet.
Yeah.
But we have all of Israel gathered together to listen to Moses. We find out in verse 3 that we're dealing with on the first day of the 11th month of the 40th year, Moses spoke to the people of Israel, reviewing everything Adonai had ordered him to tell them.
Yeah.
And so the book of Deuteronomy is kind of it's a review of the last 40 years of wilderness journey. And if you don't have the whole story of Israel's journey solid, this is a good way to kind of fast forward it. Start here.
Yeah.
And it takes you through the whole thing. I love the book of Deuteronomy. And it's an example of a new moon gathering. It's the first day of the month.
Good point. Good point. Yeah, I hadn't noticed that.
And Moses is addressing all of Israel. And he's got some great things to say, but this portion, I really love the way it ends.
Yeah, so 3:22.
Yes. Well, let's back up to 21.
Okay.
Also at that time, I gave this order to Yehoshua or Joshua. Your eyes have seen everything that Adonai your God has done to these two kings. Adonai will do the same to all the kingdoms you encounter when you cross over. Do not be afraid of them, because Adonai your God will fight on your behalf.
Yeah.
This is a theme that you and I have discussed quite a bit about, as believers, if we walk in God's authority, there's power in that.
Yeah.
And he fights the battles for us if we're walking with him. And this seems to be the focus here of, don't worry about the challenges you're going to have ahead of you, because God's going to fight those battles for you.
Yeah.
But how does he build confidence in that? Because it's one thing to tell somebody, okay, we're dealing with a generation. None of this generation were over 20 years old when they came out of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them were born in the wilderness, so they may not have experienced the whole journey. Some of them experienced the journey, but a good part of it they experienced as children.
Yeah. And that's really going to be most of them, especially when you think of the people that are actually going to be doing the fighting. It's going to be your 20-year-olds and your 30-year-olds at most. Generally speaking. So those are the people, they just spent 40 years wandering around in the wilderness. Those are the people that were born there.
Yeah.
There's nobody under 40 that was born in Egypt. Everybody under 40 was born out in the wilderness.
Right. And we have the theoretical possibility of some 59-year-olds here, but nobody older than that, except for Caleb and Joshua.
Yeah.
And Joshua is leading them on. So Moses is kind of reviewing everything that happened so that everybody has a foundational understanding of how God does things, if you will.
Yeah.
And he starts out with, you're to pick for yourselves, chapter 1, verse 13. Pick for yourselves from each of your tribes men who are wise, understanding, and knowledgeable, and I'll make them heads over you. And they answered, hey, that's a good thing. And he made leaders in charge of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. It was a foundation of the government of Israel.
Yeah.
That's an important thing to understand.
You know, one thing I noticed here, I mean, the slight joke popped into my head and noticed they're using the metric system. But they are, you know, through most of history, your leaders are going to be born into the position. And you have something, you've got the Levites, for instance, you have some of that with Israel here. But they're not doing that. And that's actually fairly rare, historically speaking, where you go out and you actually go, okay, in our tribe, who is, you know, the one that's the wisest, who has the most understanding, you know, who would be a good idea for a leader, and then picking that guy.
Well, yeah, in this government of Israel, the only folks that were born into the position were the high priest. That was passed on as a lineage. And that was not a position of authority as much as it was a position of responsibility. So yeah, that's a good point. If they're picking the leaders of their own.
Can you describe real quick what you mean by that it's not a position of authority, but it's a position of responsibility?
Well, I wish I could remember chapter and verse. Maybe we can put it in the notes as we post this. But the high priest is said to bear the iniquity of all of Israel for any mistakes that happen in bringing their offerings to God. The high priest offers atonement, if you will, for all of Israel. That weight is on his shoulders. He is the intercessor between Israel and God in the Holy of Holies.
Yeah, he certainly is on the Day of Atonement. Broadly speaking, on the Day of Atonement.
Absolutely.
But what you're referring to there actually was just maybe 3 or so Torah portions ago in Numbers.
Right.
Possibly the time of Korah. It was either the time of Korah or it was that rebellion that they had after that.
I'd have to go thumbing through to find it.
I'd have to go through as well. But God does there declare that, okay, well, no, you're responsible for this being done properly.
Yeah.
From this point on.
And that's a heavy responsibility.
Yeah.
I dare say that it's a heavy enough responsibility. If it wasn't something you were born into, I can't imagine anyone seeking it out.
Well, human beings being what they are, being the guy with the big hat, with all the shiny stuff that everybody's looking at, I don't think there's any lack of volunteers for that particular position. Usually from people who don't appreciate the responsibility that they would be bearing under those circumstances.
It would seem so, because eventually in the time of Messiah and in the time of the Maccabean revolt, it became a political position under the Roman rule. And yeah, in the perfect world, it was understood the responsibility that went with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But choosing the leadership. Now, the interesting thing is, in verse 16, at that time I commissioned your judges. Hear the cases that arise between your brothers and judge fairly between a man and his brother and the foreigner is with him. Don't show favoritism. Equal attention to the small and great. No matter how a person represents himself, don't be afraid of him, because the decision is God's. And the case that's too hard for you, bring to me, and I will hear it. You see, this is mentioned after the leadership of the thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens.
Mm-hmm.
And it was this form of government among Israel that kind of created the first sense of justice.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody could bring their case to the leaders of tens. And if he could make the judgment, he would. And if he wasn't sure, he'd pass that up to the leaders of 100 or 50s.
Well, and they're really available. Because,
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at, I think generally people understand that this leaders of tens means 10 families. But even if it is 10 families, that means it's the guy up the street. Like,
Right.
there's a lot of these people walking around
Mm-hmm.
that are leaders of tens. And in leaders of 50s is not a big jump, so you probably know that guy too. So there's easy access to justice for pretty much anybody. And I presume, I'm projecting this into this, but I presume it's also easy for those people to look around them and go, man, there's trouble going on there, because I know these people.
Yeah, I'm sure that happened.
Yeah.
I know on a congregational level, we do that occasionally. So
Mm-hmm.
I can assume that that's done there. And the interesting thing is, once again, this is presumption. But if you go to the leaders of the 10 with a problem and he can't give a judgment, I would presume that he would not just send you to the leader of 50s,
Mm-hmm.
but he would take the case to the leader of 50s,
Mm-hmm.
present what was presented to him in a way that's similar to how we would take an attorney with us today
Mhm.
in the court system to present our case. Once again, absolute presumption there.
Yeah.
But that's the thing that I see happening here. And after all, and once again, I don't remember chapter and verse, but it talks about we are to live out the word in such a way that people will say, what a glorious and just God you serve.
Yeah.
This is it is the justice that is contained in God's form of government that is supposed to make it appealing.
Yeah. Well, notice something here too, that is a subtle concept, but I think it's tremendously important. What they have is they have a law that's given from God.
Mm-hmm.
And here it goes even as far as to say in chapter 1, verse 17, for the judgment is God's.
Yes.
And so this is revolutionary. Like, law is given by man. The Code of Hammurabi is written by the King Hammurabi,
Mm-hmm.
and it's the same with others. It is the commandment of somebody holding a tremendous amount of power.
An edict of a
An
human
edict
being.
of a human being. This elevates law above the human, and also does that with righteous judgment using the law.
Mm-hmm.
Is saying, so the orientation that you have towards the law is totally different than if it's, the words of the guys that have the biggest power and the biggest weapons. Completely
Mhm.
different. This is actually fairly, we live in a world that is like that currently, because we have, equality before the law means that basically. Nobody is above the law.
Ideally.
Ideally, of course, yeah. But we have that concept baked into the United States, into the Constitution and all that.
Mhm.
And historically, it's tremendously unique. But it is really beneficial because you don't, the law is then not about who you are or what kind of power you can wield. It is, in fact, about justice.
Right.
And about rightly judging the good from the bad.
Well, something you said there triggered with me. And for so many years, we've heard, judge not lest you be judged. And one of the things among believers has been, in most of my lifetime, is well, you can't judge one another. Well, the decision is God's, as in he defines what justice is.
Yeah.
So, if God says, I'm going to be ambiguous here so I don't step on any theological toes. If God says A plus B equals C, and and somebody has decided that A plus B equals D, and you decide that I want to extend mercy and I'm not going to address that, you're fine thinking that A plus B equals D. You have, in fact, judged. But to stand on A plus B equals C, which is what God's word says, means you have not judged. You have upheld God's judgment. But to make a decision that is contrary to God's word means you did judge and you did not accept God's judgment.
Yeah. So it's like even not making a decision is a decision.
Yes. And God's system is all about justice. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm on board with totalitarian rule. But I think that we need to recognize that when God makes a decree, it's not the same as a human making a decree. We need to uphold that and not defer from his judgment, which is something we get into in the next Torah portion. We're not supposed to take away from or add to, but that's for next week.
Well, and you also, I mean, that implies, of course, very strongly that you need to be seeking out God's judgment and,
yes,
and really understanding it.
Yes.
Because if you don't understand it, if you misapply something, then, well, that's pretty bad then. So really delving into it and really like, and this is one of those things where, you know, I mean, everybody says this, it's like, you know, I've been reading the Bible for 60 years and I still find new things, you know, that come
absolutely.
up. And so it's why you can't just read it once and then think you understand what the heck is going on. And people who want to discard it do that, if they do even that much. It's like, oh, well, I read it and I found some things in there I really don't like. And yeah, okay, I'm not going to deal with that anymore.
Yeah. Well, and as we move forward in here, we've got God establishing his leadership, which is also his way of establishing justice. Then we go into the account of the spies, and in verse 28, what sort of place is it that we're heading for? Our brothers made our courage fail when they said, the people are bigger and taller than we are. The cities are great and fortified up to the sky. And finally, we have seen the Anakim there, or the giants. Moses goes on to say, I answered you. Don't be fearful. Don't be afraid of them. Adonai, your God, who's going ahead of you, will fight on your behalf, just as he accomplished all those things for you in Egypt before your eyes. And likewise in the desert, where you saw how Adonai, your God, carried you like a man carries his child along the entire way you traveled until you arrived at this place. Yet in this matter, you don't trust Adonai, your God? Even though he went ahead of you, seeking out places for you to pitch your tents and showing you which way to go by fire at night, a cloud during the day.
Yeah.
This whole thing seems to be building courage within Israel to follow God.
Yeah.
Do we still need that today?
I think we do.
I think even more so today. God was amongst the people performing miracles on a daily basis here,
Mm-hmm.
and yet they failed in their courage. Today we need to have courage to walk with God. And what I see is a tendency to ask God to walk with us. Is the difference there obvious?
It's pretty subtle, but yeah. So it's, it's like, oh, come be with me, God, as opposed to may I be with you.
Yeah. And that idea of we want God to walk with us instead of us walk with him ends up building a separation between us and him. And yes, in his mercy, he still works in people's lives that aren't ready to walk with him.
Mm-hmm.
And he'll still walk with them on a limited basis. But how much stronger would we be if we could gain the courage to walk with him wholeheartedly?
Yeah.
And I think it's good to recognize that this isn't a new challenge, that it's the same challenge. And it's a challenge that Israel's been trying to overcome for generations.
Yeah.
But I think it's a challenge that we can overcome.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we have so much history that we can look back on and be confident in God's purpose and his end goal. So like here at the beginning of Deuteronomy, well, he's just writing Deuteronomy. They don't have the rest of the Bible. They don't have Joshua. They don't have the prophets.
Right.
They don't even have Psalms. They certainly don't have the New Testament and the coming of Yeshua. We have all those things. And we've seen the effect throughout history
Yes.
of those things. And so we seem not to have the kind of miracles that you have here, in the wilderness, or that we have, immediately after Christ's ascension or during Christ's ministry.
Mm-hmm.
But we also have a lot of knowledge and perspective that they were in no position to have. I mean, even take it to a trivial example, like some of the health laws in here, where it's like, okay, well, when you touch a dead body, you're unclean. Wash yourself and wash your clothes. Okay, well, we now know why.
Yes.
At least from a materialistic point of view. There may be some additional spiritual things going on there as well, but from a materialistic point of view, yeah, dead body is not a healthy thing to be touching.
Right.
And washing yourself and washing your clothing is a very good thing to do, after you've of necessity touched a dead body.
Which, incidentally, the medical field has only figured out in the last 100 or so years.
Yeah, it's about 170, I think. Semmelweis, I think, was early 1800s, somewhere there.
Yeah, it was during the Civil War, they found out that if they got done with one patient and washed their hands before they went to the next patient, that they had a much greater survival rate.
Yeah.
That was a revelation to them.
Yeah.
And if we understand how recent that's been in human history.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, really.
Yeah. And meanwhile, people who were following the Torah, namely Jews,
Mm-hmm.
were doing this all along.
Yeah. And they didn't understand why, other than God said to.
Yeah.
Well, as we go through here, well, the thing that you said about we have more history to draw from reminds me of a phrase of a guy that was very instrumental in my ministry early on, Dr. Carl Sanders. And he summed it up with, I've read the end of the book, and we win. So it seems that Moses is sitting here recounting the history, and he's trying to encourage this generation.
Yeah.
He's trying to encourage them to do better than the generation before them. And, he talks about their challenges and, they didn't go through to conquer everybody. Hey, pay these guys money for the food and water you drink. But then the next bunch,
Sihon, I believe.
Yeah, the king of Sihon, the king of Heshbon, would not let us pass through. I'm in chapter 2, verse 30. Would not let us pass through the territory because Adonai had hardened his spirit and made him stubborn so that he could hand him over to you. And, God led through all that.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that this whole thing is all about follow God's leadership. Don't be fearful. Mm-hmm. Don't operate in the flesh. Trust my system of justice. And carry on. And I'm speaking to myself as much as anyone else out there. But I think we need to encourage one another with these words.
Yeah.
We need to trust in what God put in place, that's enough. Mm-hmm. And walk in that. Not try to reinvent the wheel. Not go, oh, well, that was okay for those people at that time, but it doesn't really apply today. What? God didn't know that that society would change a little bit? And I don't remember reading the verse to do all this until I change society and make things more modern, and then we can do something else.
Yeah.
I haven't read that verse yet.
Yeah. Well, there is that verse for the very end where, where the law will be written on our hearts and no man will teach his neighbor, to do right and wrong. I forget exactly how it goes. But that's
for all will know him.
For all will know him. Yeah.
That's for some future event.
Yeah. That's apparently at the end of this world and before the beginning of the next.
I think that's when all things are restored. Right now, we're still in a fallen world.
Yeah.
We're still decaying. We're still dying. We're still seeking to understand. I know I am.
Yeah.
I share what I can understand, and the questions I have, I share those as well because I'm looking for answers.
Yeah. And we need to seek that out. So, folks, seek out what God has to tell to you. Read the Bible. Keep doing it. Keep learning new things. Remember to walk tall and walk in God's light. Walk in his justice. Be not afraid. And see you next week.
Baruch Hashem.